I want to start today by talking about acquisition. Maybe there's no part of the space reorganization that's been as much of a focus as we need to figure out a better way to buy these things. This was also just, I think, maybe the most interesting response to me off the top of the bat from what we got. The largest cohort of respondents, about 37%, reported that the Space Force has been moderately effective at improving space acquisition, with 29% saying it's been slightly effective and 11% very effective. But notably, almost 20% of overall respondents believe the Space Force is not effective at all in improving space acquisition. And there's actually a pretty big split between the views of DoD and industry. Just 4% of DoD respondents said Space Force hasn't helped, while 23% of industry respondents said Space Force hasn't helped acquisition reform. That's kind of a pretty big split in the opinions there. And I want to start with Rosalind, maybe with you. What do you make of that split between industry and the Pentagon when talking about Space Force has been effective at changing acquisition?
So I'll start by making the observation that acquisition policy has evolved over time. There have been quite a few studies that are already out there looking at this problem and looking at acquisition across eras or eras of acquisition. And what you'll find is that from the time that it takes from a policy to be stated and then implemented, and then actually executed into acquisition, there's some lag time. Because right now, if we were to make policy changes, there's a whole set of acquisitions already underway and in the works. So those programs are not likely to change course immediately, but they can incorporate that acquisition policy change going forward, affecting some out years. So the Space Force is just a bit over a year old, and you have to recognize that even though the Space Force came with its own ideas and thoughts about acquisition and how to do acquisition, that doesn't necessarily happen immediately because there were already programs ongoing in many of the organizations that make up our nation's space capabilities. What I think the Space Force has done in terms of acquisition change is creating an awareness of the need to do acquisition more swiftly, much more agilely, and responsive to the threat. Those things aren't policy. Those things are understanding the nature of what we're trying to do with our space systems and our national security space enterprise. So just the mindset has helped to be changed by the fact that the Space Force is standing up. The policy, the actual way we implement will come as we try to figure out what's the best way to proceed in acquiring space systems and capabilities, particularly in response to the threat.
We need to remember that the Space Force hasn't even been stood up for 2 years yet. So they're going through a lot of growing pains, let alone in a pandemic where everything kind of slowed to a halt anyways. So although, some people in industry and in Congress might not see, the wheels turning as quickly as they wanted to, it doesn't mean that they're just at a standstill. So I think that before, Congress gets even more involved, we might need to give the Space Force just a little bit more time and flexibility to really, get into their groove.
Not that I don't like blaming the pandemic for a lot of things. I think it absolutely has something to do with that. But I mean, just in terms of from one administration to the next, there has not been a huge change. It really and truly in terms of what the Space Force is trying to do. To be honest, looking back at what the Space Force was attempting to do, there's just, if you ask 10 policy analysts, what is the Space Force's raison d'etre? You probably get 20 responses. And so I think that more than anything else has limited how effective it can be and, limited the organizational change just because there's just not a lot of agreement as to what its main goal is. And, again, these sort of things take time and leadership. And I think we're still early for that.